Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Salam, hello, peace to you all, and welcome to another edition of Office Hours, our almost weekly live stream discussion on Friday, usually on Friday afternoons, early evenings. This is the, I think, 41st edition of the program now. So we've really been going for a while. And we have a great topic today. Before introducing the topic and our guest, I'd really like to appeal to you to like this video, share it on social media, subscribe to the channel. And also, as you know, we always do a fundraiser, and we've been continuing for the past several weeks a fundraiser for supporting students in my online course, Guerrilla History, Anti-Colonial Resistance, History Theory Practice, online for students in Gaza. And you've been very generous in the past. What we're raising funds for at the moment is to offer the course as an in-person experience for displaced students from Gaza in Cairo on the campus of the American University in Cairo. And there are some costs associated with that, hiring TAs to conduct the in-person, but they will be taking the same course and having access to it in that way. And so if you could help us, the link is in the chat. We're trying to raise about $3,000 to support the course for about 40 or 50 students. The current course has 120 plus students. And so anything we can do, of course, to reverse the devastating consequences of scholasticide in the ongoing genocide, I appeal, to you to do. So, but without further ado, I want to talk about, this as a kind of successor to two previous really wonderful conversations with my guest about Western Marxism, about the imperial theory industry, and now a new book, Requiem for French Theory, a transatlantic funeral dirge in a Marxist key, which is a conversation between Aymeric Monville and my guest today, Gabriel Rockhill, in conversation with Jennifer Ponce de Leon, and with a really good and interesting introduction by John Bellamy Foster. It's published by Monthly Review Press, and it's been out for just a few months, and is a quickish read, although it's full of all kinds of dense discussions and things that are worth unpacking, because when you have two experts in the field, even coming from their different perspectives, of course, there are a lot of terms and kind of references to philosophical and political orientations and positions in this kind of theoretical and scholarly tradition that they know so well together. And so maybe there will be some points where we might want to unpack some of these things. So it's a somewhat dense but really excellent read. It's really a great conversation. And I'm so delighted that one of the participants in this conversation, Gabriel Rockhill, can join. And you all know him because he has, of course, been on this program a couple of times. You can go check out those discussions about his previous first book in the three-part series of the Intellectual World War, Volume 1, titled Who Paid the Pipers of Western Marxism, which was an episode we called the Imperial Theory Industry. And then we had a live in-person conversation when Gabriel came to Kingston, Ontario, of all places, to promote the book, and we had a wonderful evening of discussion. And so, Gabriel, it's great to see you again.
It's wonderful to be back. Thanks for all the important work you're doing and for hosting me for this conversation.
Well, it's our pleasure, and expecting to learn a lot. I wanted to ask you, this book is interesting because it comes out of your project. And one thing I wanted to mention is that you are, of course, founder of and participant with others in the Critical Theory Workshop, which is something that happens for a week or two, a couple weeks over the summer in Paris, and trains and engages people in this tradition of critical theory in Marxist theory. And that this book comes out of one of the sessions that you had a few years ago, in 2023, as part of the critical theory workshop curriculum. And that's why it has this kind of dialogue form, that I'm sure you've updated, but at least its genesis is in discussion and debate. Why did you have a session on this kind of topic and question, and what was your idea behind publishing the outcomes of the dialogue that was recorded, in this kind of form? What work did you want it to do? And perhaps you can tell us also what you think its kind of key themes, are.
Well, the Critical Theory Workshop is a platform that aims at having productive scholarly exchanges that break with some of the protocols of normal academic behavior, in the sense that the overall objective is for those exchanges to be productive for all parties involved. And so instead of having someone just provide a long lecture on something they've done a lot of research on and then get three unrelated questions that are usually connected to PhD projects that are very peripheral to the subject at hand, we really focus on a kind of live engagement with theory today and testing claims in a more collective environment. Aymeric Monville, my co-author, came in a few years ago to discuss his work on Michel Cluscar, who is or was, because he passed away, a French thinker who is not affiliated with French theory, and in fact is one of the few figures who was an outspoken critic of just about every French theorist, and for that matter, the more general phenomenon of French theory. I wrote the introduction to Emmerich book on Cluscar that was published by Isker Books. And coming out of that discussion, including with Jennifer Ponce de Leon, who co-directs the Critical Theory Workshop with me, we realized that there was a remarkable level of synergy between our two intellectual projects. Aymeric has been running Éditions Delga, which is, in my opinion, the most important Marxist publishing house in France, for years. He's comes out of the kind of French intellectual tradition. I have a different trajectory. I grew up in Kansas, but then ended up doing all of my graduate work in Paris. And early on, which is to say in the 1990s, I was very taken by French theory and ended up studying with people like Jacques Derrida, Luce Irigaray, Alain Badiou, and others, but quickly recognized that there were limitations to the French theoretical project. And so I ended up spending about, a little bit over a decade in France doing graduate studies and then teaching there. And in conversations with Aymeric, we both realized that although we were born on opposite sides of the Atlantic, we had come to very similar conclusions regarding French theory. And we thought that it would be helpful to work through those conclusions and also develop our own, kind of collective project around what it means to do a critical theoretical analysis of French theory, now that we have also a little bit of historical perspective, because many of these thinkers started their writing careers in the 1960s, so some decades ago. The actual publication wasn't just the recording and then transcription of a conversation that we had. Instead, what we did is had a series of conversations that were preparatory, and then we wrote the sections of the dialogue kind of back and forth, bouncing it between the two of us, and then, of course, finalized and polished the manuscript. As far as some of its fundamental themes, I know that we'll get into this in greater detail, so I might just start with the big picture overview, and that is that both of us understand that French theory is a transatlantic phenomenon. It is not theory in France. Theory in France is rather complex, is constituted by a whole series of intellectual traditions, one of the most important of which in the immediate post-war era was a Marxist tradition. And the very term French theory has now been re-imported into France in English to reference the French theorists who became famous via the United States and the larger Anglophone world. So a big part of the project is understanding the global phenomenon of French theory as, among other things, the result, in part, of US American intellectual imperialism in the post-war era and the effort to promote forms of philosophy and more generally theory that appeared to be radical but were lacking in substance and were openly hostile to Marxism in its rigorous forms. That overall framework allows us then also to dive into some of the complexities of this theoretical tradition, one of which I'll just highlight in passing, and that is that many of the French theorists they were waving the flag of various forms of German thought from the late 19th and early 20th century, in particular, the reactionary thought of Friedrich Nietzsche and the philosophy of an unrepentant Nazi, Martin Heidegger, over and against the red flag of Marxism. And this is precisely one of the reasons that they were so welcomed within the imperial core countries and the US in particular, and promoted internationally. They were also anti-dialectical, and there's a series of other themes that we could unpack in that regard. But maybe the last thing that I'd say for at least opening comments, and then we can drill down a little bit more, is that we did not want the book simply to be a critique of French theory as, in part, a product of US American intellectual imperialism. We also wanted to provide people with the most coherent methodological and scientific framework for developing a positive project, both theoretically and practically. And so the book is framed within a defense of anti-imperialist Marxism, or Marxism in its most rigorous sense, as the rejoinder to the French theoretical sophistry that we diagnose in the book.
Right. Okay. Excellent. So it brings up a lot of good topics to pursue a little further. But I think starting with that point that it is something that's created in this transatlantic relationship, and in that way is very parallel to some of the forms of critical theory that you analyzed in Who Paid the Pipers of Western Marxism, and that the construct of, the Frankfurt School's particular orientation is something that also participated in this post-World War II kind of transatlantic relationship and found its place within, as we discussed a lot, in the imperial, theory industry. So French theory as a construct and a commodity, as you point out and discuss at length, is something that depends upon this kind of relationship and the consumption of these kind of particular thinkers and strains of ideas in the United States that then give greater prestige and also material support for their recirculation, around the globe. But I guess I wanted to ask you, at least from the start, is the way in which, certain kinds of adoption of German theory. So this is also a kind of continental story as well, of like what gets absorbed from the continental philosophical tradition in Germany into this new kind of orientation of French theory. And in the book, you and Aymeric discuss a lot of something that he has written about, left Nietzscheanism, the recuperation of Martin Heidegger's philosophies, notoriously a pro-Nazi academic in Germany, and the sort of reactionary kind of sources in some ways for French theory. So I guess my question would be, how is it that reactionary sources of conservative thought, that are all, standing very much in opposition to Marx, Hegel, the French Revolution, right? How was it possible for these to be transmuted into important sources for an apparently left and radical kind of orientation? Because I think that's the important thing. If it was just obviously conservative, right-wing, reactionary thought, it might not have had the kind of circulation it did, and wouldn't have done the political work that it did. So this seems to be something of a contradiction. How do you explain that in the history and in the character of this appropriation of these conservative strains of like 19th century German thought into some kind of a quasi progressive package for left theory in France and the United States after the war?
That's such an excellent question. I just think I should touch on very quickly the relationship between the kind of critique of Western Marxism and Who Paid the Pipers, and then this book. And I'm currently completing or correcting the proofs for the second volume of the trilogy on the intellectual world war, which is called French Theory Made in USA, which overlaps, of course, with a lot of what we're going to be talking about. But one thing that's been important to this project in general is recognizing how ideology often produces false antagonisms, and that we need, as materialists, to be able to identify behind those false antagonisms shared ideological orientations, right? So you have the Republican and Democratic Party, and anyone paying attention knows that the opposition is one in which they actually share the fundamentals, which is capitalism and imperialism. When I was taught, and as these traditions are often taught within the academy, Western Marxism and French theory, they're often presented as opposites, with Western Marxism being more dedicated to forms of materialist analysis, social critique, rationality, etc., and postmodern French theory, abandoning that in favor of either textual analysis or a kind of questioning of all things to the point of irrationalism. But what's important to recognize, and this is one of the things that we point out in the book, is that both of these theoretical traditions are grounded in a kind of compatible left ideology in which they might be, and sometimes are, quite critical of capitalism, in particular, the effects of capitalism on the consumer middle layer in the imperial core. So the effects of capitalism on subjects like them. But when it comes to the question of actually existing socialism, they withdraw in horror, and for the most part, and with almost no exceptions, they condemn it as worse than capitalism. And so part of this broader project is revealing the ideological bedrock, if you will, behind traditions that are often not only presented as opposites, but there are, massive intellectual controversies between French theory and the and Western Marxism. I just wanted to note that, but getting more to the point of your question, in the immediate post-war era, of course, in Western Europe, Marxism had an incredible level of public credibility because the Soviet Union with China, which was not yet socialist, but had a very, very powerful communist movement that would take over the country in 1949, they had defeated fascism, right? The war was in the East, and the communists had just defeated the fascists. In the immediate post-war era, then, many were moving further to the left, and there was an intelligentsia that I don't think you could really describe as just Marxist, but there was a very prevalent orientation towards Marxism among certain sectors of the intelligentsia. France was identified by the US national security state as one of the kind of jewels in the crown of imperialism that needed to be kept in the Western fold. And therefore, they ran Plan Cloven, which was the US national security state operation to not only destabilize, neutralize, but ideally eliminate communist influence in France in every sector of society, right? From the unions to the political parties to civic associations to the universities to national education, on and on and on. In that particular context, and we have to remember that the French theorists who are the most famous, like people such as Michel Foucault, Jacques Lacan, Jacques Derrida, Deleuze, Guattari. These are people who began their intellectual writing careers, some of them as early as the 1950s, but then largely in the 1960s. This is only about 20 years after the end of World War II, when a lot of the French intelligentsia was at least Marx adjacent or open to certain forms of Marxism. And they began waving the flag of people like Nietzsche and Heidegger in the context where it was recognized globally that the most famous philosopher of the Third Reich was Martin Heidegger, And Herbert Marcuse had actually confronted Heidegger about his collaboration with Nazism, and he refused to go back on the positions that he'd taken, meaning he was not only a Nazi, he was an unrepentant Nazi. So you have to kind of situate yourself in this material context. Moreover, Friedrich Nietzsche, who's known for his, wild and iconoclastic style and his rejection of the protocols of, bourgeois morality, actually, if you understand his philosophy and have read it in a systematic fashion, you recognize that there's a very clear through line throughout Nietzsche's work, and that is an endless war on socialism. He was against the herd, the masses, the slaves, and he advocated for the defense of natural social hierarchies between the nobles and the slaves. And he wanted to rejuvenate that type of politics for an era of great politics in the imperial age, even defended not only slavery and colonialism, but has positive things to say about eugenics, about misogyny, and other such things. He was a reactionary philosopher. So in this specific context, recuperating Nietzsche and Heidegger as the primary intellectual sources. There are a few others like Ferdinand de Saussure, who and various earlier forms of structuralism that, of course, could be added to the equation. But when you're looking at figures like Deleuze, Derrida, Foucault, Heidegger and Nietzsche saturate their work in both explicit and implicit ways. And in this particular context, it would have been very difficult to simply say, well, we're bringing Nazi philosophy back. We are bringing reactionary anti-communist philosophy to the forefront. So instead, what they did is they brought Nietzsche and Heidegger back in a kind of camouflaged manner in which they tried to present them as philosophers of difference that could be mobilized for their project of anti-totalitarian thinking. What this meant, to unpack it a little bit, is that they relied on an idealist version of history to claim that Hegel and Hegelian dialectics amounts to reducing difference to identity. So anytime there's something different, it would be subsumed through these dialectical mechanisms into an identity, and that identity and that identity-based thinking, the thinking of the totality and the reduction of otherness to sameness, somehow led to the Holocaust. And that Marx, in continuing the Hegelian project of dialectical thinking and thinking the totality, laid the intellectual, and at least the intellectual groundwork for the gulags that are described in this kind of propagandistic manner as being more or less similar to the Nazi concentration camps. Now, I'm simplifying a little bit just to clarify exactly what the lines of demarcation are. But what they attempted to do, these French theorists, is to rehabilitate Heidegger and Nietzsche as anti-totalitarian, radical critics and philosophers of difference, thereby weaponizing them against the Hegelian and Marxist tradition of dialectical thinking and analysis of the totality, etc. All the while, of course, creating a terrifically misrepresented straw person of the Marxist tradition of Hegelianism, of dialectics, and reducing those traditions to an attempt to crush difference in the name of sameness. And so there's a lot of the discourse of French theory that needs to be understood in terms of a kind of pale reflection in the intellectual realm of the Cold War, in which the realm of sameness, conformity, the gray on gray reduction of difference to sameness was the big bad world of the East, whereas the world of the West recognizes difference, celebrates individuality, recognizes singularity, etc. And so there's a kind of philosophic framework, if you will, that they deploy that just about anyone familiar with French theory will immediately recognize. and that is that difference is better than sameness, heterogeneity is preferable to homogeneity, and there's a whole series of value concepts like this that they almost feel like they never have to justify or ground, because implicitly within that is the idea that the realm of difference and singularity and freedom is preferable to this homogeneous realm of the East. And so maybe just bringing some of those threads together, and I'm happy to unpack this more if this is too, I guess, philosophical or too abstract for any of your audience. But one of the ways of understanding what they were doing is trying to bring back fascist philosophy, but in the luggage of the kind of moral and compatible left of an anti-totalitarian discourse that made it look like they were fighting communism today, just like they were fighting fascism, yesterday. And of course, in a specific context where being anti-totalitarian is just a stand-in for being anti-communist, because they generally understood that, or thought that, fascism had been defeated in World War II, so the enemy that they were fighting was communism. All of this to say then that one of the questions that the book raises is the extent to which we have liberal, radical liberal, anarchist, Trotskyist adjacent French theorists who are actually recuperating fascist philosophy as a weapon of war against anti-imperialist Marxism.
Right. Now, I would wonder, they probably would not have conceived, all of them, that this was what they were consciously doing. It may be the effect of their appropriation of these sorts of ideas to wrestle, to reject a kind of materialist dialectical orientation in order to, kind of preserve what they thought was some kind of sort of liberal valorization in some ways of difference and so on. But I mean, I think one kind of point that I would make about that it seems is involved in your critique of this, is that it had an anti-humanist sort of orientation and strain. Because of course, you could say we are all, if we're all human, that is a kind of unity, of identity of the category of the human, and you have to valorize or privilege certain kinds of difference over that base and fundamental sort of humanist kind of recognition of sameness, even within all of this. So I guess my thought also would be, what would be the response to how dialectical materialism is not to be, that this is a twisted characterization of what dialectical materialism does, or Hegelian influenced, that it isn't about reduction of all difference into some kind of sameness or totality. How would one, distinguish what actually it does, from that kind of a charge? And I think sort of related is a question here that came in. Do you think it's accurate to say that French theory not only denazified Heidegger? I mean, I guess the point is, how can you denazify him? But I mean, in terms of the image of Heidegger, to sort of de-emphasize and recuperate him, not as a Nazi, but also secularized him. And they point out that it can, that much of his work, especially later works, can be read through a Catholic theological lens.
Definitely.
And from what I understand, he's most studied at Catholic-flavored universities in the U.S.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that they particularly secularized him, insofar as there is a very strong prevalence of theological discourses throughout French theory, depending on the specific figure, right? Someone like Foucault or Deleuze was less so. Someone like Derrida and Levinas were very, very, imbibed by religious traditions, in particular
Or Georges
Judaism.
Bataille.
Georges Bataille is another example.
Desserteau, I mean.
Of course, yeah. No, the theological. In fact, Dominique Janicot, I don't know if the book is translated, but wrote a very good book on the theological turn of French philosophy. And he goes into some detail on this front. Regarding the issue of dialectics, I think that one of the things that French theory attempts to do, drawing on Nietzsche and Heidegger, is to regress to pre-dialectical forms of thinking, or what Engels described as metaphysics, where the world is composed of fixed and static structures that sometimes enter into oppositions, but these oppositions are not contradictions that can be overcome through a dialectical process of transformation, but rather dialectics is frozen kind of at a standstill. And you get this very clearly in, Lyotard, Derrida, and people like this, who will celebrate paradoxes and aporias and claim that what we should do as intellectuals is recognize them, not try to work through and overcome them. But that is a very anti-dialectical position. It's a metaphysical reification of an opposition, if you will. From a dialectical vantage point, the relationship between sameness and otherness is not this metaphysical reification of these two fixed forms, if they be conceptual or somewhat more material. And I don't know, Levinasian ethics would be one example of that. But instead, that these are conceptual placeholders for processes that are much more complex than the categories that we have for analyzing them. Therefore, it's not just a matter of reducing otherness to sameness or something like this. One of the definitions that I think is quite incisive regarding dialectics is when Lenin refers to it as many-sided knowledge. You look at all phenomena from every perspective, and you understand the sheer complexity of all of the connections between that phenomenon and all of the other phenomena constituting the social totality. And so instead of reducing otherness to sameness, it is trying to provide the most coherent map of the complexities of the social totality and the forces driving that social totality as it changes over time. Because another leitmotif in a lot of French theory is a rejection of the subject or of agency in favor of an analysis of fixed systems, structures. And in doing so, there is, again, we see this kind of manifestation of an anti-dialectical tendency, and also a downplaying of agency in history. Because if there are only structures of meaning or epistemes that more or less magically change at one point in time for someone like Foucault, then human beings aren't the makers of their own history. Instead, these static structures more or less impose themselves on human beings who are the recipients and just reacting to systems of signification or structures of discourse or other things like this. And so part of the anti-humanism that you highlighted is also this anti-subjective or the rejection of the subject and the rejection of agency. But you also touch on another really important point, and that is the rejection of universality. Right? If everything is difference and singularity, and we might not be able to think the totality, etc., then you openly reject the category of the human as a universal framework by which we can understand Homo sapiens as not being divided between races, genders, in a meaningful sense. Like, of course, at other levels, there are class struggles that are gendered and racialized and all of this, but there's one human family. And this is important as well, because what they're recuperating from Nietzsche and Heidegger is also race-based thinking and essentialism that had been one of the clear targets of Marx and Engels' critiques going back to the 19th century. So we see that at that level. Maybe the last thing that I highlight is I think it's very important what you pointed out. When I'm saying that there's this play of difference and sameness that is a pale reflection of the broader ideological dynamics of the Cold War, I'm not saying that every time Derrida put pen to paper, he was thinking explicitly about what it was that he was doing. What Engels refers to as the semi-autonomy of ideology is so important to foreground in this regard. These discourses kind of took on a life of their own, and they often function in such a way that there are unspoken givens that people come to accept. Like when I was trained in French theory, I learned that difference is better than sameness. But I never learned how to justify that, because it doesn't actually have a justification. If you drill all the way down, it doesn't have a justification. But I knew that that was the way that discourse had to function. It was always better to be on that side than on the other side. And so there's also the kind of practical ideological habitus of those who are participating in these discourses. They kind of know certain things at a semi-conscious level, and they follow the patterns of those discourses. And they also know, very importantly, what type of discourse is going to get promoted in France and internationally versus the types of discourses that are going to get demoted. And they tailor their work to those, that kind of push and pull, if you will, of the broader material system of intellectual production.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really important point, and in some sense, that kind of quasi or semi-autonomy of an ideological, cultural matrix that is rooted, of course, in actual institutions, actual, kind of career pathways and validation, by the state, by, funding agencies. These are the kinds of things that you've detailed and discussed very powerfully in Volume 1 of the Intellectual World War, which is a really important basis for continuing to do this kind of intellectual history. And in fact, actually, what it reminds me is of a question, because you also mentioned this kind of structure versus event and the way in which structuralism and this kind of antagonism between the structure and the event, right, is actually what they've done is making impersonal embedded structures that are very unchangeable, but also aren't thus not subject to agency or accountability either. I mean, this is another component of it, versus events, which then you can't explain and understand. Well, like, what are the sources of events, and do events have any relationship to these structures? If they're not predictable by the, operating of the structure, they seem to be things that somehow are violating the structures, or so this kind of, even this division, though, of taking history and then having this kind of dichotomous sort of points of emphasis, either structural or, looking at, events and the play of politics, for example, or trying to have theories of the event that don't connect it with structures or earlier histories, seems to me it's a classic conundrum of historical and social scientific thinking in, like, the modern Western academy. Like, for those decades, this was like something that bedeviled people, is how to understand structures in relation to events, and how do you explain events, and all of this. But it seems to me that it is just a way of avoiding a real complex engagement with the question of base and superstructure, right? And you have a kind of position on that, and I think that's something that I would like to ask you a little bit more about, because it also might help us fill in and see some of those complexities you were talking about in our analysis, and how ideas and ideologies interact with the material conditions that might be sometimes described as structures, but even those are not structures in this French theoretical structuralist frozen entities. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about how reimagining the relationship between base and superstructure can kind of help us really understand how dialectical materialism works, and how the ways in which French theory really avoided actually doing the real theoretical work to describe the world, right? Like, that would be required by connecting those productive, modes of production, material conditions with worlds of culture and ideas and ideology.
The distinction between structure and event, you're absolutely right, is a reification of two kind of oppositional poles that leave us kind of in an impossible situation. The French have the expression where you have your ass between two seats, right? You aren't really one, you aren't really the other, you don't know how they relate. And so I'm familiar, of course, with some of these endless debates on how they interrelate, et cetera. But the problem is the methodological starting point, right? There isn't just structure and then these miraculous events, but instead the starting point should be from a materialist analysis of the socioeconomic system of production. So the fundamental way in which human societies have been organized to produce the goods and services that allow those societies to function. And if we look at that level and provide a materialist analysis of the kind of totality of social relations of different socioeconomic formations, then it becomes clear that the political world as well as the cultural sphere are kind of outgrowths of the specific ways in which production is organized. And this is, of course, looking with a macro historical perspective. If you're in a hunter-gatherer society, the forms of politics and knowledge and culture that are produced are going to be markedly different than in a feudal society or in a capitalist society. And the reason for that is not because you have a reified superstructure and then a reified base, and that these, kind of march along in this clumsy manner and then are magically reconfigured. It's rather that there's a dialectical and materialist relationship between the two, such that our language usually runs up against certain limits in its capacity for description, right? And Marx insisted, this is a metaphor, the base and the superstructure. It's a simplification. But the best way I think that we can get at it is that the superstructure is the set of kind of political, legal, and social institutions that, in the broad sense of that term, that grow out of the socioeconomic base, but that also, of course, then have an impact on, guide, constrain, construct in various ways that socioeconomic base. And in that way, we have a much more sophisticated model for how history operates. We identify the fundamental driving forces, which are the productive forces and the class struggles around those productive forces, not something like an abstract and usually idealist structure or set of structures, and then some hypostatized event that would interrupt them. And so we can engage in a materialist analysis of how the superstructure and base have transformed over time. And as well, this is important because then we can situate our own work subjectively within those objective systems. And this is another thing that we point out in the book, is that for all of their attempts to present themselves as radical masters of suspicion, who are always raising questions and always critiquing the question that or the presuppositions of the questions, always outsmarting their interlocutors, the French theorists, for the most part, maintained a fundamental blind spot when it came to their own social relations of intellectual production. Meaning, precisely since they were not trained and did not take seriously the dialectical and historical materialist tradition, they were incapable of recognizing that they were subjects within an objective system of knowledge production that was fashioning and having an impact on the type of work that they were doing. And therefore, they left themselves bereft of critical theoretical tools of self-reflection. And much of their theoretical practice, as Aymeric and I spell out, is a matter of also producing a discourse that is palatable to empire. Because ultimately, the superstructural forms that we have in the culture, in the capitalist world today, these are the superstructural forms of the leading imperialist powers. Therefore, if you want to advance within the dominant system of knowledge production within the kind of imperial core countries, and particularly in the US, where the French theorists became famous, then you have to produce forms of knowledge that receive uplift from that superstructural order. And this is precisely what the French theorists did, consciously or not, or semi-consciously for that matter. And so I think we see here as well the extent to which a dialectical and historical materialist approach also gives us a much more coherent and it's a much more coherent account that also has a lot more explanatory power than what you get in, for instance, Foucaultian history of epistemes and their kind of magical reconfigurations over time, or other versions that one could point to coming out of the French theoretical tradition. There was a lot, Adnan, in the question that you just
Yeah,
asked, so I feel like I'm
yeah.
I'm only touching on like one or two.
Well, it's I mean, it was a big question, and there's been how many thousands of pages written about the either the like structure and event and or base and superstructure or metaphor in Marxist thought, and so it's a huge topic. But I do feel that the kind of intermediating analysis that you're doing historically of tracing out, as you did in who paid the pipers for Western Marxism, of funding agencies, of the ways in which these institutes are and their association with major prestigious and well endowed universities like the Ivy League, and also state institutions
Yeah.
like the CIA and its research, kind of arm interact, and that kind of fills in some of the ways that we can see how certain geopolitical and economic orientations of empire post World War II, led by the United States, helped position certain forms of culture, certain forms of intellectual inquiry, uh, as long as they could be anti-communist and as long as they undermined, certain orientations towards class analysis, um, and I would say even an attack on, the very idea of history, which is, I think, a really important kind of component that is often not uh, characterized well in these theoretical discussions, partly because French theory and critical theory have done such a good job of suppressing, you might say, real genuine historical consciousness in these abstract ideas. But I was very interested in, a point that was raised in the book, that Marx thought, history is the only science, like, in a way. And what does that mean? It means that material reality and its change over time, is basically the subject of all science. It's like, because it's always moving and changing, the really existing world has to be described through natural science and through social science, all of which is the study of history, essentially, of what exists. And so there's two things that I wanted to ask about this. One is, perhaps not as interesting, but I found it intriguing. It's a little bit abstract, but it was a discussion that you and Aymeric were having about the integration of the social and the natural in forms of science, and whether there were the possibilities of integration, you might say, because one of the effects of Western Marxism, that he and you both were kind of analyzing and complaining about, was the reduction of Marxism to a field of study and not a particularly, valued one in the social sciences and the humanities, but not, it doesn't have any connection to science, technology, the natural world. And of course, we see that is, of course, an ideology of capitalism, to say any kinds of, radical ideas about the nature of society are to be quarantined away from their relationship to the natural world, which is, just something to be exploited, and is a hidden an externality of, like, capitalism. So there's no social basis for really analyzing, how capitalism degrades and destroys the environment, right? So we
Yeah.
can see that that's a kind of important outcome of the segmenting of forms of knowledge and quarantining, them. But, it is a kind of counterintuitive to many things. I mean, I'm a medievalist, so I, have in mind an understanding that previous forms, of social and scientific kind of inquiry were very holistic in their integration. And of course, there were theological and cosmological assumptions that we might falsify from other, kind of later scientific observations and so on. But there was something interesting about the integration of a holistic way of understanding the world in which one piece of knowledge pursued with great precision wasn't somehow disconnected from its kind of broader or total meaning. That those relations, even if they're very tenuous and very long, the chains of connection, there was some sort of conception that everything that happened in the world was somehow part of a organic system, right? And this is definitely not the way we think about the world. And the example that you were talking about, or maybe it was Aymeric really who was talking about, was about genetics, right, and biological science and study, and the way in which perhaps what now people are recognizing in terms of epigenetics, that there are ways in which human biology might be affected by the social conditions, the traumas, the forces, etc. That there is some kind of way in which these could be more integrated, and that there were Marxist scientists in the Soviet system who were trying to think about these things, but of course any such research or outcomes was completely suppressed, denied, pilloried as unthinkable. Rather than actually studied in a scientific method, right? So, at any rate, that kind of idea of the social and the natural world being more integrated was very interesting to me, but I'm not really familiar with how one might think that you know, in a more contemporary kind of frame of mind. I'm wondering if you had thoughts about that and whether that is something as part of your project, towards the end of the book, there's a chapter, towards a revitalization of Marxism and forms of Marxist thought. I'm wondering if you see that as one direction of trying to reconstitute a revitalized Marxism that appreciates and understands the contemporary world and integrates. I mean, we see that in Marx. He's always very interested in actual science of his day, and he sees these as very connected with insights that he might have. Sometimes they're just analogies, but other times they're actually very materially significant for his thinking through, society, politics, economy, etc. So that was a curiosity I had about whether this is a direction you see as part of the project of revitalizing Marxism and what that could look like in our time.
I think it's a great example of what we were just talking about with base and superstructure, insofar as the intellectual apparatus, meaning the part of the superstructure that produces, circulates ideas, has demarcated the world in particular ways. And these are complex histories. In fact, my very first book was, to a large extent, on this phenomenon. The extent to which the overall framework of knowledge within the capitalist core countries, really over the last 4 or 5 centuries, has been reconfigured slowly in fits and starts, etc., in such a way that there are some fundamental divisions that were introduced. One of the divisions is between the humanities that have to do with human subjects and all of this, and the social sciences that would purportedly focus on the broader social world. And another distinction is between both the humanities and the social sciences on the one hand, and then the so-called natural sciences, right? The reason it's important to recognize this is, just as you were saying a moment ago, these things didn't fall out of the sky. They're not eternal. They're historical products. And so when Marx and Engels are writing in the latter half of the 19th century, this is already a process that is very well underway, particularly in 19th century Germany, in which there was a very high level of institutionalization of knowledge. And the way they developed dialectical and historical materialism, as you see in particular in Engels' later writings, was as a rejection of the ideological division between humanity, the social world, and the natural world, recognizing that we need to approach these phenomena holistically, rather than accepting what is at base a kind of capitalist ideology. And that is that, well, the human world is over here, functions according to its own rules. The natural world is external. And of course, baked into this is a more or less naturalized hierarchy in which nature is there for us to use, meaning to exploit for profit. And in this way, then what Aymeric and I are advocating for in the anti-imperialist Marxist tradition is really tapping into these deep threads of the classical Marxist tradition that have a holistic approach and that don't accept the ideological divisions of knowledge that are so prevalent within the bourgeois academy. Also, because a lot of Western Marxism and critical theory more generally has been subjected, potentially somewhat subconsciously, to these divisions. So Western Marxism, for the most part, rejects what is called the dialectics of nature, an analysis of the natural world. They also tend to reject any analysis of political economy and just focus on culture, and usually culture in the way in which it's studied more in the humanities or the humanities leaning social sciences, right? So you already see within Western Marxism the ideological impact of this imperial superstructure on the divisions of knowledge and basically on the withering away of Marxism from a holistic project to a very atrophied and limited intellectual endeavor. What this holism looks like and its relevance to the present is, I think, readily visible within the broader ecological movement. In order to understand the world that we live in, we have to recognize that the social system that's currently dominant around the world, capitalism, is destroying the natural world to such an extent that it's going to eliminate its own conditions of possibility of existence because it's going to destroy humanity and a large part of life in the process. Therefore, one of the fundamental contradictions on planet Earth is between the socioeconomic system that's predominant and the natural order that we have. The metabolism between the two is completely out of sync, right? Thinking here of the work of John Bellamy Foster, but also Ali Kadri and Brett Clark and lots of others. And so part of the Marxist project needs to be a full embrace of the holistic project of understanding that any social order that we have is nested within the natural order. Human beings are animals. We are part of this socio-natural totality. And therefore, our social theories have to not only take this seriously, but also have to orient their horizons toward the construction of a socioeconomic system that functions in greater metabolic harmony with the broader natural world, which is something, of course, that we see in Cuba with its incredible environmental projects, in China with its environmental civilization, or other examples that one could point to. And so I think it's also important, not just theoretically, but also practically, because it demonstrates that Marxism has not only been at the vanguard of the struggle against, obviously, exploitation and oppression, racial, gender oppression, but it has also often, at least in its best elements, been at the vanguard of the struggle for maintaining a harmonious relationship to the broader natural world. Now, of course, there's lots more packed into what you said, and I would just point your audience to the great tradition of the kind of Marxist philosophy of science, if you will. In the UK in particular, this has been quite well developed, but elsewhere as well. These are thinkers who have analyzed science not from the point of view of kind of bourgeois philosophy of science, but understanding science, including the science of the natural world, within this broader framework that situates it within the kind of socio-natural totality that I was talking about.
Okay, that'll be very helpful. Yeah, but this is really interesting. I hope people found it. It was something that intrigued me in it. I know it wasn't the main focus of any of this, but I wanted to ask you about it. But perhaps coming back to the argument of the book is, well, one small note was about those historical schools. So in addition to the construction of some, commodity of French theory that you've been analyzing, you do have some remarks about and the CIA report from 1985, France, Defection of the Left Intellectuals, does also briefly mention the importance of the emergence of the Annales school of history, which, had great transatlantic prestige and became a real alternative. I mean, we're seen as, of course, as an alternative to political and diplomatic history on the one hand, but something that wasn't Marxist, dialectical, materialist history. It wasn't like, say, the British Marxist historians, you know, uh, regardless of whether you like the making of the English working class or think that it's problematic. I mean, there was this very serious school of Marxist historiography that could have been extremely influential. It had a lot of impact, but could have been even more influential in the Anglophone world, particularly like in the United States and Canada, and, Australia and New Zealand, etc. But in fact, actually, during the 60s and 70s, the most important kind of school of history was this French school of the Annales school, which was overtly anti-communist, had a very kind of odd understanding of what capitalism was as a I mean, designed to think of capitalism not as Marx did, but as some other set of processes, but to still be pretending to really analyze capitalism, but to fix in a structuralist sort of way, a way of understanding and reading history, its relationship to geography, and so on, while removing the dialect. I mean, I just think of this one important essay by Fernand Braudel. That is about temporalities in the social sciences, where he theorizes that the real kind of contribution of his magnum opus, the study of the Mediterranean in the age, Mediterranean and the Mediterranean world in the age of Philip II. It's this like 3-volume thing that gets translated into English as well and is seen as his magnum opus. Is he says there are different layers of historical time that we could understand, and there's the longue durée and the very long kind of period and what relates to it, and there's these other temporalities, and that politics is this sort of very episodic, it's like grains of sand being blown in the wind over these dunes, right? And it's not actually a theory of change at all. Like it is really just a kind of description of different structural layers that really subordinates genuine causality, right? I mean, like it really just doesn't deal with the real problem of causality in change. And this is a school of history that was supported by the Ford Foundation, and it was received in like the Anglophone world, United States, as the most kind of influential avant-garde kind of, until the cultural turn, of the like 80s and 90s. This was seen as like the most kind of important way to approach history, and yet it's tied to the very same kinds of institutions, orientations as an anti-communist, non-Marxist kind of explanation of history that's funded by the same kinds of institutions that are, elaborating, French theory. And so I wondered if you had any sort of thoughts further about this kind of relationship with the Annales school, and is that something that you're discussing? It's mentioned briefly in this book,
Yeah.
but I'm wondering if you're explicating that further in your second volume on French theory made in the U.S.
Yeah, I am. Adnan, could I take just a 2-minute break real quick and come
Oh
back and
yeah,
answer that question?
oh yeah, sure,
I'm so
absolutely.
sorry. I just have to do one thing real quick.
Go ahead, go
Be
ahead.
right
In the
back.
meantime, I can ask everybody to like, share, and subscribe. So like the stream, share it on social media. Um, Perhaps you can also subscribe to the channel. Um, and also, in the meantime, also let me tell you where you can get this book, right? It's published by Monthly Review Press. Requiem for French Theory, Transatlantic Funeral Dirge in a Marxist Key by Aymeric Monville and Gabriel Rockhill in conversation with Jennifer Ponce de Leon. It has, actually, I think the introduction by John Bellamy Foster is really excellent too. Really interesting analysis himself. And so you can get that book. You should, go ahead and get it. You can also go back and listen to the two previous conversations that I had with Gabriel, both about the imperial theory industry, which was really discussing the book, Who Paid the Pipers of Western Marxism. And also then we had a kind of follow-up discussion on office hours that also is available, and I believe that was just titled Western Marxism with Gabriel Rockhill. Also, I want to remind you that if you could please support my students in Gaza and also the students who are taking the same course, Guerrilla History, Anti-Colonial Resistance, History Theory Practice, as an in-person course being offered at the American University in Cairo. Please do support it. It would be really helpful if you could donate and make sure that students who have been suffering through the genocide, but also scholasticide, are still determined, even though they're not getting any university course credit or it doesn't contribute to any degree. The fact that there are 120 students in Gaza who are interested in pursuing their education by any means necessary, we have to do what we can to support them in that endeavor, because that is an act, a heroic and courageous act of resistance. So please do donate to the course and make it available for students. Okay, Gabriel, it was like a really long and rambly kind of comment and question, but maybe you've got some thoughts on
No, I
the
really,
Annals School.
yeah, I really appreciate it because it does figure in the second volume and is a very good example of the ways that a materialist analysis of the superstructure, which we were talking about before, always requires a very fine-grained engagement with the details of the set of relations within that superstructure, so that it doesn't just become this kind of abstract and rather cumbersome and simplistic analysis. And one way of bringing to a head the importance of the Annales School is to recognize that the primary institutional stronghold of the Annales School was an institution called the Practical School of Higher Studies, l'École pratique des hautes études, and in particular the sixth section of this school. This also was the stronghold of French structuralism. It was funded and supported to the tune of well over $1 million back in the day, which is far surpasses that today, by Ford and Rockefeller. And the specific institution evolved in 1975 into the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales, so the School of Higher Studies in the Social Sciences. This institution, the EPHE, I'll just call it, was the sixth section, which Braudel was a major figurehead in, was modeled on and influenced by the area studies programs that had been established in the United States. Rockefeller paid for many of the leaders of this institution to come and study the area studies programs in the United States, meeting in particular with the directors of the Russian Institute at Columbia and the Russian Research Center at Harvard, both of which, as I detail in my previous book, are Central Intelligence Agency cutouts, meaning that they quite literally took researchers who were working for the US National Security State and relocated them, giving them academic cover. And these institutions themselves were set up with directly with the Central Intelligence Agency and with the university administration. When Braudel and others then went back to France to establish these area studies programs, they did it in such a way that they were policing the kind of left border of critique. And in fact, I was able to find in the archives the documents where Braudel explicitly states that any funding that he gets from the capitalist ruling class via, I think in this particular case, it was the Rockefellers, will not land in the hands of communist researchers, and that the one or maybe two figures identified within his immediate orbit having communist leanings, he guaranteed them were under strict discipline and control because he was overseeing these collective research projects. In other words, he was guaranteeing to the capitalist ruling class that they were going to get a return on their investment that aligned on their political interests. All of this then demonstrates to some extent that the Annales school, very much like French structuralism, which, if people aren't familiar with the term structuralism, we can just take it as a kind of stand-in for the general kind of French theoretical enterprises that are well known in the United States, were part of this institutional outpost within Paris that was recognized as one of, if not arguably, the most important outpost for anti-communist scholarship within the network of the Rockefeller project known as the Marxism-Leninism project. And it therefore was part of the overall architecture of the intellectual world war on Marxism. This goes a long way then, this broader context, to explaining why in the 1985 CIA research paper that you referenced, they refer to the Annales school and French structuralism, particularly Lévi-Strauss and Foucault, as having made an important contribution to the discrediting of Marxism within the broader social sciences. Here we see that the close collaborator of the Ford and Rockefeller Foundation, the Central Intelligence Agency, was on the exact same page as these funders. And so we have the opportunity to recognize the kind of broader ecosystem within which all of this operated. It's very important to recognize, of course, that none of this means that the Central Intelligence Agency put a gun to Brodel's head or even gave him a briefcase full of cash. Like all these 007 versions that unfortunately pollute people's minds, as well, because the Central Intelligence Agency has been involved in producing so many of the films about the agency and thereby promoting these ideologies. It's much more a kind of materialist ecosystem that organically emerges out of the capitalist base, but then is often structured, massaged, directed in various ways by the capitalist ruling class and state actors to make sure that if the system isn't functioning like it should, that it does function in that particular way. So the Annales school is quite significant. Last thing that I'll say is, of course, the Annales school there's a complex history to this historiographical school, and certain members of the first generation, I'd highlight Marc Bloch in particular, were doing very important Marxist work. And so we're talking mainly about Brodel, Lucien Febvre, and what's sometimes referred to as the second generation. Sometimes people like Michel Foucault are affiliated with the third generation of the Annales school, although, they're debates about this, but it's clear that his version of history, in which you don't have change driven by class struggle, but instead these kind of cataclysmic, more or less reconfigurations, is very much in continuity with some of the things that the Annales school was doing.
Well, it's sort of yeah, I mean, I think there's a structuralist element to what he's talking about without a theory of how and why those structures suddenly change.
Exactly.
So it's like, focusing back on, it's a different way of trying to bridge the structure versus event kind of analysis. These are all different ways of trying to parse that without kind of dealing with material conditions, causality, and a dialectical method. There are different ways of trying to avoid that. It seems. Yeah. No, they're fascinating. Yeah, so it's kind of like the intellectual Marshall Plan, right? It's
That's
like
exactly it.
reconstruct the, institutions, post-war Europe, and infuse money and aid to make sure that the outcomes of the society, its institutions, its politics, its economy don't, go, communist. Yeah, so
Exactly.
amazing. Yeah, well, I mean, my interest in somebody like Brodel is both because of this kind of connection that you're talking about, but also because he was himself somebody who taught in Algeria during, French colonial times and loved, absolutely really loved Henri Piren's kind of Mahomet et Charlemagne. And in fact, actually, Henri Pirenne, the famous Belgian historian who wrote this thesis, Muhammad and Charlemagne, that basically you could not have, Charlemagne, i.e., the base for the future orientation of a Western Latin Christian Europe, without the effects of the Muslim conquests and the apparent the refusal of the Arab barbarians to act like the German barbarians, which was to recognize that Rome was a higher civilization, Christianity a higher religion, and assimilate themselves to it, and that this had a deleterious effect on like global world history. That explains the pathways of Europe and also justifies colonialism. And he ended up giving this talk in French Algeria, and somebody like Braudel heard it and thought this was the most amazing and marvelous form of world historical kind of socioeconomic analysis, because it's all about trade being disrupted in the Mediterranean. But it wasn't Marxist again, right? So, and so he's really inspired by it. And so that raises for me an interesting point and question. I know was throughout the work about the importance of an anti-imperialist orientation, but in the, it was brought up by John Bellamy Foster in the introduction, I think very kind of clearly and directly, and maybe this is an opportunity to talk a little bit more about it, because he argued that one of the problems of French theory is that it was incredibly Eurocentric in its perspective on the world, that this internal dialogues and play of signs and signifiers and obfuscatory kind of left Nietzscheanism and Heideggerianism, really also suppressed a genuine kind of understanding or interest really in resistance to capitalism that might be coming from other sources, and so he highlighted, I think, the importance of an anti-colonial trajectory, in which you would think of Fanon as, and I guess this is where I wanted to actually go, which is where some of the kind of more recent kind of moves, if French theory is over, and even the CIA was saying in 1985, yeah, it's kind of passé and outdated. After 68, maybe these people lost a little bit of their, kind of relevance, at least in France, even if they could package their radicalness, in the U.S., as you've analyzed, that there are other schools of theory and history that really rely upon the work of of this French theory school that are more relevant and are relevant today, like decolonial, theory and decolonial history and identity politics, I guess you could say, that's also somewhat connected with these. And so I wanted to bring up the kind of question of colonialism and how someone like Fanon is seen as everyone likes black skin, white masks, and a certain reading of Wretched of the Earth that suppresses the kind of materialist kind of analysis that he's doing, even if he does have a critique of Western Marxism, which is that you haven't theorized the colonial condition and its relationship to, this situation, and, how racism operates, in racial regimes like, settler colonists in Algeria, how that operates within a global, sort of system. That kind of analysis is often sidelined to, different kind of ways of portraying the relevance and value of Fanon. So I'm wondering if maybe you could talk a little bit about, what some of the consequences for decolonial theory, its reliance upon French theory, and how that has been developed in some ways to, along with this kind of critique of Marx as Eurocentric, right? So we need a whole different theory in order to be able to understand anti-colonial movements and decolonization, processes, and, upending the Western episteme, but we don't need to it doesn't go back to Marx or Marxist and other materialist kinds of theory. We need to invent a whole new one because that was Eurocentric.
That's such a interesting set of questions, but it really goes to the heart of one of the thematics in the book, and that is the way that the colonial question is this fulcrum point where you can easily distinguish between those who go in a more kind of Western Marxist postmodern French theory direction versus those who go in an anti-imperialist Marxist direction. It's true historically that in the immediate post-war era, some of the most visible French intellectuals were Sartre, de Beauvoir, and they were very close with Fanon. And they have their own political trajectories in fits and starts, but did support certain important anti-colonial movements and were close to the French Communist Party at one point in time, were Marxist or Marxian with some Western elements, but nonetheless, they occupied a public position that was quite visible. In the next generation, right? So it's not a matter of these theorists not knowing what was going on, right? They are living during the Algerian War, the wars of independence across.
Derrida was even from,
Yeah,
like, had
so
grown up
many of
in
them.
Algeria,
So many of them
Yeah.
were born in North Africa,
Yeah.
and so those histories were not only, they were the present, and at the same time, then in turning away from the more Fanonian or kind of anti-colonial Sartrean perspectives of their immediate intellectual predecessors, they were instead following the lead of someone like Merleau-Ponty, who had been close with Simone de Beauvoir and Sartre, but then broke with them on the war in Korea, refusing to recognize that the so-called Korean War was a war of anti-colonial liberation, and instead took the position that basically the capitalists and the imperialists did. And in that regard, a lot of the French theoretical tradition either turns a blind eye to colonialism or is so focused on kind of Western European debates that some of them even engage in pro-colonial work insofar as Foucault was a resolute defender of Israel. He also advocated quite explicitly for the colonization of Eastern Europe, meaning something along the lines of the Reagan Doctrine, in which communism would be overthrown, it would be reintegrated into the capitalist West. Levinas, of course, was a Zionist and quite dedicated one in that regard. So there's quite a bit of settler colonialism, even just within the French theoretical tradition. And the connection to decolonial theory, I think, is quite important, because one of the things that we try to highlight in the book, thus far our discussion has been focused really on the kind of critique of French theory, some of the Annales school. And one of the things I really appreciate about your work in general and all of our conversations is, like me, you're very interested in method, because how we do things determines so much what we do and the nature or the ways in which those practices are developed. But it's also true that the book in general engages with a whole series of other thematics, right? It's dealing with fascism, the question of China, the history of French politics, the expansion of US imperialism, and other such things. And one of the through lines that we're now getting to in the book is also the chameleonic nature of ideology. That ideology critique is not just a matter of a subject standing back and identifying in the external world, the existence of ideology in a particular body of writings or a film or something like this, but it's instead the recognition that ideology functions as a material system that goes through different permutations, and in fact needs to, because reality keeps percolating up through the ideological forms that we have. And so if you're familiar, as unfortunately I am, with the dominant radical liberal discourses in the academy and the imperial core, you know full well that French theory in certain quarters is still very prominent. But what is much more cutting edge is a whole series of discourses that are doing more or less the same thing, but with different vocabulary and sets of references that appear to be much more international, sometimes even quote unquote third worldist. So if it be post-colonial studies, if it be decolonial theory, liberal queer theory, various forms of, radical Black theory that's non-Marxist. There's lots of these traditions around, but if you analyze them methodologically, what you recognize is that they're making many of the same moves. They're just doing it in a slightly different manner. And of course, this is also the result of historical transformations. In the in the latter half of or third of the 20th century, we were still living within a broader intellectual world in which a bunch of white men from Paris could become famous within the United States. Now, in the 21st century, the leading kind of thinkers pursuing these same basic traditions generally look quite different, because they're people like Gayatri Spivak, they're people like Judith Butler, or others who are continuing these traditions in various ways. Mignolo would be another one, Enrique Dussel. I mean, there's a very, very long list. So the reason that ideology has to be chameleonic is because it constantly has to cover its tracks, and it has to try to tamp down on a reality that's piercing through. And one of the realities that's pierced through is colonialism, is the fact that colonialism is alive and well. And therefore, these French theoretical discourses that either ignored colonialism, supported colonialism more or less directly, did not really give us the type of discourse that was necessary. Therefore, if it be post-colonial studies, or decolonial theory, you have these new ideological permutations that are trying to deal with the persistence of colonialism. So in that regard, they're reacting to reality and neocolonialism. But at the same time, they're trying to do it in such a way that they're still anti-Marxist, and they're recuperating those interested in the broader question of colonialism within the general ways of thinking of postmodern theory. In that regard, you have a kind of reduction of colonialism to an epistemology, something like the coloniality of power, this nebulous, very Foucaultian way of thinking that purportedly dominates the entire Western world, and that we need to resist by developing other ways of thinking, new discourses, etc., sometimes new practices, but those are never articulated in a very coherent manner when it comes to praxis in the Marxist sense. And these discourses themselves are resolutely and quite openly anti-Marxist, and they traffic in the same stereotypes about history that the French theorists developed and also, promoted. And these are versions of history that suggest that somehow Marxism wasn't fighting colonialism and therefore is reducible to this Western episteme. And all that this does is it erases, or attempts to erase, the ways in which Marxism, not only post-Marx and Engels, but already within Marx and Engels, at least as of the 1850s, because if you do a serious analysis of Marx and Engels, you recognize that they, like all of us, are subjects situated in an objective world, and they changed over time. Their ideas evolved as they developed in relationship to a shifting world, and the colonial question became extremely important for both Marx and Engels, if it be the question of Ireland, if it be India, if it be the question of slavery in the United States. And in general, they evolved to a point of recognizing that a more cosmopolitan version of history that you get in some of Marx's early writings, in which capitalism was going to be primarily a developmental force and there was a kind of unilinear historical model, was radically called into question, so much so that in some of their writings, they say that, well, now it's actually the colonial periphery that is going to be leading the struggle against capitalism, because these are the most oppressed and exploited workers of the world. And so we already within the classical Marxist tradition, of course, by the time you get to Lenin and Zetkin and others, it's even more developed more at an even higher level because of also changes in history. And so what those traditions are trying to do is to push back against the anti-colonial, anti-imperialist tradition, which is the Marxist tradition, and replace it with some new and sophisticated way of thinking, which ultimately is going to be and is capitalist accommodationist and usually resolutely anti-communist. And many of these thinkers then draw on these French theorists without recognizing the political positions that they took. For instance, Levinas is a major reference point for people like Nelson Maldonado Torres, Enrique Dussel, and others. Levinas was a colonial thinker, not at a minor level, but through and through. I trace this out in the second volume of my book because Levinas is someone I've studied very closely. And how can you draw on a colonial thinker, or how can you draw on Heidegger, as someone like Chakrabarty does, in the name of decolonizing our minds? Like, if you're going to decolonize our minds and you're not interested in actually decolonizing the world, then at least draw on some anti-colonial thinkers like those in the Marxist tradition, as opposed to those who were resolutely colonial.
Yeah, really important, it seems to me, to understand this, the repackaging, I guess you could say, with different languages. Again, with the semblance of it being extremely, kind of radical, but yeah, I guess one because we've had a couple questions come up. One person has been very insistent. What about the field of psychoanalysis? Where that fits in this? And I know you do mention Lacan, and I guess in the probably volume 2 you will be discussing Lacanian kind of psychoanalysis as well. And of course, you do write about, I think in a very humorous and incisive way, about capitalism's court gesture, whose great claim to fame is about integrating Marxism and Lacanian psychoanalysis. We're of course talking about Slavoj Žižek. What would you say about the positioning of psychoanalysis in this kind of imperial theory industry and its circulation, particularly the French components of it?
Yeah. Well, in Western Marxism and French theory in general, you have a widespread critique of classical Marxism for purportedly ignoring subjective questions or issues of the unconscious, and therefore psychoanalysis being a necessary supplement to Marxism, right? So you get the Freudo-Marxism of the Frankfurt School, or in French theory, you get a kind of Lacano-Althusserianism, right? Where you bring together Althusser and Lacan, giving us figures like Badiou, Žižek, and others. This, I think, is a misrepresentation, first and foremost, of the Marxist tradition. To suggest that it doesn't have an account of human subjectivity is just to ignore the entire body of literature on ideology and the constitution of subjects. It is also, unfortunately, there are a few exceptions to this that I can think of, but usually psychoanalysis is embraced as this kind of radical discourse without questioning the framework of Freudian psychoanalysis and the way in which it was developed, because Freud was in many ways a bourgeois liberal whose work was clearly situated within a kind of colonial framework that was masculinist, that was that saturated as well by the kind of racial dynamics of colonial capitalism. Lacan, for that matter, has been called out in very important ways by critics who are self-described as either feminist or queer or anti-colonial. And so psychoanalysis also has some extreme limitations that have to be highlighted, which is not to say at all, and this is always the position that I take, I'm always for dialectical critique. Are there insights within Freud and Lacan? Yeah, absolutely. Are there things to be learned from them? Yes. While at the same time, you need to be able to, if you want to learn at the highest level, situate their subjective production within the objective social totality within which they operated. And so I think from a Marxist vantage point, it's also important to recognize that there are traditions of psychoanalysis, or even more generally, kind of materialist psychology, that have been critical of Freudianism while drawing on certain insights and positioning human subjects within the broader social world. Fanon is a good example of it. So is Cornelius Castoriadis, even though he identified more as a kind of libertarian socialist. He has very important critiques of Lacan that I think any materialist should take seriously. But at an even higher level, in my opinion at least, would be Vygotsky and the Vygotsky school in the Soviet Union. So it's not as if the Marxist tradition has to ignore insights from psychology. It's instead that they always have to be situated within this kind of framework of the socio-natural totality that we were talking about earlier.
Yes, and I would recommend. I'm sure there'll be quite a lot in volume two, but there already was some important discussion of Freud's ideas and its adaptations in the United States as part of the marketing, basically developing the information war, the psychological war, and also, of course, the synthesis among some of the figures in the Frankfurt School of Marxism and psychoanalysis and
Yeah.
critique of the ways in which they did. So I would encourage people to go to that volume as well, where they will find, some interesting insight in the relationship between this imperial theory industry and its, geopolitical economy, you could say, in the intellectual world war. But you've been very generous with your time. I don't want to take too much more, but I thought, since we have been talking a little bit about the complicity, in this intellectual world war of various intellectuals, whether it's Fernand Braudel as the, kind of grand patron of the Annales School and really of the practice of history and study of history in the university system in France in the 50s, 60s, 70s. He just absolutely dominated the study of history there. And also many of the other figures that you've been talking about. There's been an open letter that has circulated where very prominent and important intellectuals, academics, some people who have been and are political prisoners, also, but a sort of odd concatenation of people in an open letter published in the Guardian, addressed to political prisoners in Iran. That circulated widely, and had a number of really problematic kind of components that really leveled a kind of comparison by putting them in this sort of framework, the political prisoners in Iran with like Palestinian prisoners in Israel, or the largest group of prisoners in the world in the U.S. Prison industrial complex system, many of whom are avowedly political prisoners. And one could argue that there is a politics, for many others who wouldn't be categorized as political prisoners who in fact are. So there was a lot of reaction to this letter, and some people, of course, were very displeased with the kind of statement being made. I'm wondering, how you would analyze this in light of your discussions about the compatible left and the co-opting and circulating. Because I guess one component that I'm interested to hear you discuss is what I would regard as this imperialist first world status of these kind of celebrity left intellectuals and the kind of positioning of themselves as being able to comment on things happening around the world, and that as if it's vocalized as if they should have an audience of people in the rest of the world who would take very seriously their critique of Iran's carceral system. When it's obvious that it's printed in The Guardian in English, okay, there may have been a Farsi translation circulated as well, but its audience is clearly for the left in the West. And so I wondered how you would kind of see this within the framework of the geopolitics of the imperial theory industry and support for kind of compatible left intellectual class?
The first thing that I would say is that this letter picks up on the tried and true tradition of compatible left intellectuals who might be critical of capitalism in various ways, but will always condemn the anti imperialist struggle. And they advocate at best for kind of magical third way politics, saying, well, a pox on both houses. Neither Washington nor Moscow was the mantra of yesteryear. Now we hear neither Moscow nor Tehran. And it begs the question of, well, where do people go if you're not imperialist or resolutely anti imperialist? Well, the answer is in many ways for a lot of academics, it is that, well, we need a new idea, a new theory, a utopian horizon, something that gets very mythological. And they're trying to encourage people to kind of stand on the sidelines from global class struggle. And it's telling, of course, as you mentioned, that these are not all of them are academics, but I believe all of them are situated in the imperial core, the majority of them in the United States, the signatories, that is. It is obviously a letter not to political prisoners, it's a letter to the West, and in particular the Western left. We know that The Guardian, I touch on this in volume 1, has a history of working with intelligence networks, like all of, or the overwhelming majority of the mainstream press within the imperial core. It is interesting that there was so much pushback, because I personally don't remember other letters like this, because we've all read them in the past, if it be around Syria, Libya, other such, Afghanistan back in the day. The amount of pushback does indicate that the imperial hegemony exercised by the United States and the Western powers in general is not at the level that it was in the past. I do think that there are clear ways in which this was, whomever is really behind and driving the letter, operationalized at a very specific moment in which, of course, support for the war in Iran is extremely low, including just for the Trump administration. There is an increasing level of awareness of Iran's role in the resistance that I think needs to be still expanded. And there are more and more people who are getting on board with an anti imperialist orientation. And so there's a lot of fear that the struggle for a free Palestine will develop into a struggle for a free West Asia, and a recognition that Iran plays an absolutely central role in the defense of sovereignty across that entire region. I'll note as well, because I think it's important for the broader material context, that one of the most stalwart defenders, because if I'm not mistaken, there's about 5 people who have withdrawn their names at this point in time. One of the most stalwart defenders, Yassin Al-Haj Saleh, was, according to Max Blumenthal, a US government informant who is listed as strictly protect in leaked State Department cables, which is interesting. And it's also important to note that the organizing metaphor for the entire letter was this idea that people are stuck between the two blades of a scissor, right? Or scissors. The horrible regime in Iran or the imperialist West and in the United States in particular. But this is actually a quote from Siamak Namazi, who's a US Iranian businessman who's imprisoned in Iran on espionage charges, right? So this raises some serious questions about what's driving this letter, who was behind it, how many of the signatories saw the final version, etc. I don't know if we'll get to the bottom of all of this, but what's very clear is that it is an attempt to discipline the Western left away from positions of supporting, even at a tactical level, right? So not strategically like Iran is the be all end all of everything that we'd ever want in humanity, but at a tactical level where you say, well, at this point in time, it makes sense to stop the US Israeli imperialist war on the entire region for Iran to have the right to armed self defense, and put halt as much as possible to the extreme levels of degradation that have been unleashed, and just murder across the entire region. And so here we see, kind of bringing all of this into focus, the broader geopolitical role that's played by the compatible left. They are trying to drive people away from resolute anti-imperialist positions and into these kind of sidelined uh, stances that consist in saying, well, I do condemn US imperialism, but I condemn in the same breath and just as much those who are resisting imperialism. Right? This basic mantra, which has been used again and again and should be just a worn out trope of the Cold War, right? At this point in time, we should see this stuff coming down the pipeline from miles away and say, no, we're not dealing with this discourse anymore of neither Washington nor, and then just fill in the target country of Washington. What this is trying to get us to do is to tap out from the anti-imperialist struggle in favor of a position that ultimately ends up being accommodationist towards imperialism, because, and we have to recognize what the interests are that are driving a lot of this. That is that it is recognized by the capitalist ruling class and their state managers that they can't just get rid of Marxism. They can't just get rid of anti-imperialism. They can't get rid of resistance. So what they try to do is defang it in such a way that it is no longer a powerful force, and it's turned into something like an anti-imperialist position that's so sophisticated that it rejects the very struggle against imperialism. So I find that this letter, of course, is just continuing this tradition, but the most exciting and important thing about the letter is the amount of pushback, because it demonstrates that anti-imperialist forces, even at an ideological level, but of course also at the practical level, which is the most important one, are growing. And this is one of the reasons that these compatible left intellectuals had to get on board, or decided to get on board with this type of project. Its failure is, I think, a testament to the amazing level of struggle on the part of the Iranians and anti-imperialist forces practically and intellectually around the world.
Absolutely. That is the most amazing thing, is that five people felt themselves pressured enough politically to withdraw their names. And the amount of reaction, response, undermining the credibility of the letter and the position that it's taken, in many places on social media is really quite remarkable. I mean, as you say, there have been so many of these letters in the past, and we haven't seen the kind of response that was immediate, overwhelming, and very insistent, and that shows that there is a clarifying of political consciousness, and that the attempts to obfuscate in this disinformation war aren't working as well as they perhaps once did. But this is one of these rearguard attempts. I think, it's very obvious in the kind of selection of some key names that there was a sort of attempt to try and divide or pit elements of, pro-BLM, anti-carceral, anti-police brutality movements that have been so significant. The fact that so much of that movement has gone into the Palestine solidarity movement, and could conceivably, if we were able to overcome some of these, I think, vulgar sort of like people, not the state solidarity, which has inhibited a genuine anti-war movement from really distilling and crystallizing in an organized fashion to try and put a stop to this war, because of all of that sort of propaganda and that sort of kind of misemphasis, of what the politics of solidarity should look like, in this moment against empire. That has really inhibited really having that kind of a, but it's building. It's actually happening. The longer this war goes on, and the more Iran's resistance to empire is being celebrated and noticed and understood by, social justice activists around the world, there is a risk and a danger that Iran's sort of soft power as an anti-imperialist force, I mean, that's what people care about. They're interested to learn more about what is Iran's kind of system, and why are they so committed and dedicated to the cause of Palestine and in solidarity with Palestinians? Like, these are questions now that are at the forefront of people's consciousness, and so this seems an attempt at trying to divide some of those forces that could come together in a genuine collective anti-imperialist moment and develop a movement against this war. That's what's been targeted in some ways. That's what's been targeted. And I think it's also interesting to have the timing, understanding that this is at the time of the failure of the military and of the other kind of forms of political and diplomatic pressure, and the economic, kind of strangulation is what they're supposedly turning to now in order to try and foment, what happened in late December and early January, is economic hardship that leads to fissures in the society that can be exploited politically, attempt to be exploited politically. So a letter like this is, coming just at the moment when they need a revival and reorientation in the Western left, to divide and undermine in this strategy of trying to kind of promote an economic and kind of political internal disinformation, and try and revive sort of some sense of internal critique of the government and of the Islamic Republic of Iran, and above all highlight its oppressive nature to solidarity activists elsewhere. That seems to me very relevant. And how could anybody who was involved in these kinds of political movements put their name to a letter at this moment? Like, it's like what you were talking about, these French intellectual figures who know exactly what's happening with settler colonialism in Algeria, the death, the destruction, the racism, but have nothing really significant to say, and whose theories, are about avoiding any kind of, encounter with the consequences of colonialism. The same thing here. And these are the people who are often held up as anti-colonial or decolonial scholars, who then brand and name those who are actually in solidarity with people struggling against empire as hollow anti-imperialism. It's very hollow that they're like actually defeating the U.S. military, right?
Yeah. No, I think those are such important points. The only thing that I would add is that the list of published signatories also reads like the crème de la crème of the kind of radical, liberal, Western, Marxist intelligentsia. And so there's also an attempt to discipline the broader intelligentsia, because all of these people, I think without exception, are at very elite schools and occupy really pole positions within the US Academy for the most part, a few in the UK. And what that does is, if the creme de la creme takes these positions, it communicates to all their students, all the professors working under them, all the conference networks, all the publication networks, that that's the position to take. And then you can consolidate within the intelligentsia the marching orders that then go out in all the university classrooms and all the publications and all the conference circuits to the larger public. And this is a way of making sure that you kind of consolidate what the acceptable position is by having very elite academics all come to agreement on what is ultimately the most important thing. I'd also note that you have in the letter signatories who are Western Marxists, people like Alberto Toscano and others, Ruth Wilson Gilmore. You also have representatives of the continuation of French theory like Judith Butler. You have liberals like Jason Stanley. You have Keeanga Yamada Taylor, who is a kind of, I don't know how exactly you describe a social democrat of sorts, but definitely not an anti-colonial Marxist. And so you have this kind of consolidation as well of some of the traditions that we've been talking about. And you see the ideological confluence, right, where they agree on the most important issues, and that is anti-imperialism, which amounts to a capitalist accommodationist and ultimately an imperialist accommodationist position. And very importantly, it actually does not matter if they're conscious subjectively of this or not. Because objectively, the purpose of the letter is to do all of the things that we've just mentioned, disciplining the intellectual class in order to discipline the larger working class, and divide, as you were saying, the movement for the liberation of Palestine and the general liberation of the entire region from imperialism. And so if the signatories think they were doing something else, like just expressing their good politics or fighting for humanity, then it is secondary to the objective role that it plays, meaning subjective consciousness is always secondary to the objective social totality and the forces operative within it.
And it's very possible to recognize and realize that you may not have thought carefully about the objective conditions in which this subjective identification with, oppressed prisoners, or, this is something that they said, well, it was very natural of me. I've always been against, the carceral state and having been a prisoner. And so, okay, so that's understandable that you would have sympathies, solidarities, for anybody suffering in those kinds of positions. But then step back, look at the objective conditions in which your solidarity or feelings of, empathy and political identification are being employed for what purpose, right? It's very possible at that point to say, okay, while I am against oppression, everywhere, I think at this moment it is a mistake to, endorse this letter because it's participating in something that's only going to enhance the oppression of 90 million, people in Iran, and also further, for its kind of deleterious effects in undermining, our solidarity and anti-war movement domestically. So I pull back from that, and I think that it's wrong, or I regret having signed it. You could do that, and a few people did, but they didn't do it from the analysis that you were giving about the problem of the objective conditions. They, framed it as, well, I wasn't, I didn't see the full draft, and various, kind of suggestions of manipulation. Maybe there were, but you know what? That's not politically significant or important, because if that's the case, publish the letters, publish the email soliciting, what did you see, do the political work that's necessary to expose these manipulative, kind of networks that are trying to mobilize, leftists on behalf of imperialism. So that would be a benefit to reveal these networks, and then we'd be more educated on how they're operating, who's involved, etc. So you have to do one or the other, right? It seems to me, either expose them or condemn, kind of the way in which this letter is working, and that, you didn't recognize that. It's possible to be fallible in your political analysis. And that's something I would say in general about most of the academics here, is why would we expect them, given their class position, given their position in the Imperial Academy, to be the most kind of to have the most advanced political consciousness? This is the problem that we're dealing with, is that our movements, instead of being connected with worker struggles, anti-imperialist struggles, where those movements and those who are active in them are actually developing their political consciousness to the most vanguard, perceptive analysis of the time. Why would we expect people who are generating kind of theory texts or working on, other sorts of topics within the Imperial Academy to be the leaders of where our political consciousness and political positions should take us? I think that's another problem, and shows the weakness of Western left movements, is that these are our leaders. These are the people we look to, rather than actually getting, busy with developing an anti-war movement that connects the domestic defunding. And, this letter didn't say enough, it seems to me, with the, way in which the military and carceral spending, is connected to this imperial, and that interconnections that we've learned about them. Instead, it was amazing that they were talking about, the building of the prisons in Iran without even saying that was under the Shah, who was the U.S.'s, vassal figure there. So it seems to me that there was opportunities even in the reaction once they recognized and realized that
Yeah.
this was problematic and was being recognized so broadly speaking in community of people who are engaged in this kind of activism and in anti-imperialist organizing. There were opportunities to try and remedy this situation that many of them didn't even take at all. And those who even
Yeah.
did pull back didn't do, it seems to me, the political work that would have been valuable in that moment, to model, how we should deal with like questions of solidarity and accountability.
Yeah, those are such important points because one of the things that I try to demonstrate in my research is that precisely because the intellectual world that we have in capitalist countries grows out of its socioeconomic base, the creme de la creme of the intelligentsia actually does have a vested interest in maintaining both capitalism and imperialism because they are positioned at the very top of the pyramid of, intellectual labor production. And therefore, it makes perfect sense that people like this would sign this type of letter. They're quite literally doing their job. And it's also for one of those for this reason that they have so much political and media access. And one of the reasons I take it that the people who didn't sign, or I'm sorry, that removed their signatures from the letter did not release a kind of public statement defending the right of Iran to armed self-defense under imperialist siege, or, you know, taking a more explicit position against US imperialism and the right to fight against it, is precisely because they want to maintain the kind of broader network of which they're a part. And when you come out as a strong anti-imperialist, what you do is you get targeted by precisely these types of people and you get excluded from these communities. Maybe the last thing that I'd say is that I like the fact that you touched on this kind of abolitionist discourse, which is so prevalent in the letter and also in the work of many of its signatories, Angela Davis, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, and others. The abolitionist discourse is a good example of a kind of compatible left way of thinking about carcerality, as it's referred to, or imprisonment, which tends to erase global class struggle and does not recognize that there is an enormous difference between a capitalist prison and a prison in a country like Iran or in a socialist country, in which many of those incarcerated are Mossad agents, CIA agents, people who have committed heinous acts of terror and sometimes murder against civilian populations. And you need to account for the materialist reality of prisons, situate them within the global social totality, and then analyze them accordingly. And I thought it was very good what you pointed out about there's not a critique here of the history of the Shah's practices, of course, backed by MI6 and CIA, which were absolutely heinous and extraordinary at the level of its attack on the civilian population, or for that matter, deep and serious critical reflection on the US carceral system, which of course is known as being the largest per capita in the world, and also with deplorable, absolutely deplorable material conditions. So this also, I think, demonstrates the tonality of the letter and the abolitionist kind of discourse within it, the limits of these radical liberal compatible left critiques that don't engage in a materialist analysis and that don't recognize very basic things like institutions like prisons will be necessary under socialism, both to deal with, common law offenses, murder, rape, and things like this. We'll have to deal with some way of sequestering people who commit those acts and hopefully re-educating and reintegrating them into society. But they're also there in order to keep the imperialist warmongers out. And that needs to be part of any analysis. We can't just traffic in this more utopian idea of just abolishing all carceral institutions, devoid of any analysis of the class struggle operative within and around those institutions.
Well, the larger kind of point here is that there's such suspicion of any kind of organized power, and institutions. There's a very kind of anarchistic sort of strain here. We might agree. I mean, in fact, I really hope we will see the day when, we have the withering of the state, but that's only after certain kind of class conditions prevail. Until that happens, you can't just remove any of the institutions that protect the people or support them either from external imperialist invasion, or from subversion internally, as you were just pointing out. And I think that's also something that's very endemic to the French theory that you've been discussing and talking about, is this kind of libertarian almost, or anarchistic kind of critique of the state, which is part of the way in which it has condemned, or that's part of the condemning of totalitarianism. And it can also be taken to the level of essentially condemning any form of organized state authority or power or institutions, without that class analysis against which to judge it and its place within, say, the capitalist imperialist world system, those material realities. It's just an ideational kind of like hostility to the idea of power being oppressive in every kind of way that a state may use it, right? So
definitely. And there's a really simplistic populism, right, that you find in this letter, and it's very pervasive in the Western left. You're for the people, but against all these big bad states and these political organizations and things like this. Well, where are the people who live without any organizational form? Like, what people are you actually for? Because all people are situated within social institutions and state formations. So it's a real utopian, otherworldly appeal to the quote unquote people, devoid of a materialist analysis, grounded in the fact that the state is the organizational form that is currently operative in the world today. And so the real question is not, I support an imaginary people against all states, like find some people without any states. Or, I mean, granted, of course, there are autonomous movements and things like this. So I recognize that, of course. But the whole point is to develop a state form that serves the people instead of a state form that uses and abuses people to generate profits for those who control the state from above because they're the ruling class. So the real question is, do we have a progressive state that serves the people and that is against empire building, or a state that is capitalist and imperialist?
Absolutely. Well, this has been really such a fascinating conversation. I've enjoyed so much, Gabriel, and you've been very generous with your time to talk about the book and also, spend extra time discussing this letter and some of the consequences and implications. But it's a great example of the value and importance of the work that you're doing in terms of the various forms of compatible left and imperial theory that has a practical impact on how we understand politics in our present moment, and some of the ideas that are behind these confusions and contradictions that are dividing and inhibiting us from building what we desperately need, collective solutions and movements for freedom and liberation. So I really think this is wholesome and helpful. I appreciate all the work that you're doing. People should go get the book, Requiem for French Theory, a Transatlantic Funeral Dirge in a Marxist Key, that you wrote with Aymeric Monville in conversation with Jennifer Ponce de Leon, and an excellent introduction by John Bellamy Foster. And I think people are also going to be looking forward to the appearance of Volume 2 of The Intellectual World War fairly soon in the coming months, and I hope we'll have a chance to talk with you again about your work when that comes out. So I want to thank you again. Everyone was really appreciated in the chat. And I want to thank the people in the chat and the audience. Please do like, share, and subscribe before we end the stream. But I really appreciate the excellent conversations taking place, and tried to highlight some of them and bring some of your questions to the fore. This has been the 41st edition of Office Hours. And I just want to remind you about the fundraiser for my students in Gaza, the online course, Guerrilla History, Anti-Colonial Resistance, History, Theory, Praxis. Please do support it. The links are in the chat. And you can find the link to buy the book, from Monthly Review Press in the video description. So until next time, peace with justice and solidarity to you all. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim.